The tree had been there longer than the houses, longer than the neat sidewalks poured in straight lines to suggest order where there was none, longer even than the association that now claimed authority over every blade of grass. It rose from the edge of my property like a quiet witness, a broad, canopied giant with roots that had learned the soil through decades of droughts and storms. It shaded the driveway in the afternoons and caught the wind at night, turning it into a low, calming sound that felt like breathing. People slowed when they passed it. Birds nested there season after season, returning as if the tree were a landmark stitched into their maps. That was why the notice felt unreal when I saw it stapled to the bark one morning, flapping slightly as if embarrassed to be there. The paper was bright white against the rough brown, printed in heavy official font, and it announced itself with words that tried to sound clinical and inevitable. Hazard removal assessment. Immediate compliance required. Auction scheduled pending non-payment. The association seal sat at the bottom like a signature that dared anyone to question it. I stood there longer than I meant to, reading it again and again, because the words refused to align with reality. The tree was healthy. An arborist had inspected it 2 years earlier when a neighbor complained about falling leaves, and the report had come back clean, praising the trunk's integrity and the canopy's balance. Nothing about it was hazardous except the way it challenged the association's appetite for control. The notice cited bylaws in small print, references to emergency authority and cost recovery, the language of power that hides behind procedure. It demanded a fee so large it felt less like a penalty and more like a ransom, and it warned that failure to pay would result in the association arranging removal and auctioning the wood to recover costs. It was that last line that stopped me cold. Auctioning my tree. The idea felt absurd and invasive at the same time, like being told someone planned to sell a piece of my history because it inconvenienced their schedule. The neighborhood around me looked the same as it always did that morning, sprinklers ticking, cars backing out of driveways, a jogger passing with earbuds in, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. I pulled the staple free and folded the paper carefully, the way you handle something fragile even when it is. Inside, the kitchen smelled like coffee and toast, and the window framed the tree in its usual place, solid and calm, unaware of the threat written about it. I sat down and read the notice again, this time slower, tracing the clauses that claimed the association had the right to act without consent in cases of imminent danger. There was no mention of any inspection, no report attached, no explanation of what danger the tree supposedly posed. Just a deadline and a dollar amount. Experience had taught me that this was how these things began, not with open confrontation but with paperwork that assumed obedience. I logged into the association portal and found the assessment already posted to my account, labeled as non-negotiable. When I tried to submit a request for documentation, the system returned a generic message about review timelines, days it implied that I did not have. Outside, the tree cast its shadow across the lawn, leaves moving slightly, indifferent to the human systems that had decided to put a price on its existence. I called an independent arborist that afternoon, one with no prior connection to the association, and scheduled an inspection as soon as possible. In the meantime, I began documenting everything. Photos of the notice as it had been attached, close-ups of the trunk showing no cracks, wide shots of the canopy, timestamps embedded in the files. I requested records from the association under state law, asking for any reports or votes related to hazard declarations in the past year. The response came back automated, polite, and empty. The deadline crept closer. A second notice appeared, this one mailed, repeating the same language with added emphasis, reminding me that failure to remit payment would authorize removal and auction without further notice. It was signed digitally by the board president, a name I recognized from newsletters and carefully staged photos at community events, always smiling, always framed as a volunteer serving the neighborhood. The arborist arrived 2 days later and spent hours examining the tree, tapping the trunk, checking the roots, measuring lean and canopy spread. The report was thorough and unequivocal. The tree was healthy, structurally sound, and posed no imminent risk. It recommended routine maintenance only, the same advice given to countless mature trees that coexist peacefully with houses. I forwarded the report to the association with a formal dispute, attaching the law that required them to consider evidence before acting. The reply came back shorter than expected, acknowledging receipt and stating that the board's determination stood pending further review. Pending. The word did a lot of work there, implying a process while advancing toward the same outcome. Then came the email that changed the shape of the situation entirely. It announced that the tree had been scheduled for removal by a contracted service and that the resulting material would be auctioned to offset costs with any surplus applied to my account. The auction date was listed, along with a lot number. They were moving forward despite the report, despite the dispute, despite the absence of any emergency. That was when curiosity turned into resolve. Auctions leave trails. Even the quiet ones create records, listings, bidders. I searched the lot number and found a notice on a regional salvage site. Minimal description, hardwood from mature specimen, estimated yield. No photos of the tree standing, just generic images of logs. The seller was listed as an intermediary company I hadn't heard of, but the contact email followed a pattern that felt familiar, the kind used by people who prefer to appear separate from their interests. I cross-referenced the company registration and found it had been formed recently with a registered agent who shared a last name with the board president. It could have been coincidence, but experience suggested otherwise. I dug deeper, tracing addresses, filings, connections that most people never bother to look at because they assume systems are honest by default. The pattern sharpened quickly. The intermediary had no history beyond a handful of transactions, all tied to association-managed properties. The registered agent was the board president's sibling, a fact confirmed by public records and a family business website that proudly listed shared accomplishments. The auction wasn't about hazard removal. It was about profit, about using the association's authority to seize an asset and redirect its value to someone inside the circle. The realization brought a strange calm. The story had shifted from a dispute over a tree to something larger, something that would not survive daylight. I organized the evidence meticulously: screenshots, filings, timelines, the arborist report, the notices, the auction listing, the corporate records. I knew how these channels worked, how outrage spreads when it's grounded in specifics, when the narrative is clear and the receipts are undeniable. But before anything else, I needed to stop the removal. I filed an emergency injunction request, citing the lack of hazard evidence and the apparent conflict of interest. The court date was set just days before the scheduled removal, a narrow window that felt intentional, as if the association assumed no one would move fast enough to challenge them. Outside, the tree continued to do what it always had, marking time in rings no one could see yet, indifferent to the paper storm gathering around it. Neighbors began to notice the notices and ask questions, their curiosity piqued by the idea that something so familiar could be declared dangerous overnight. I said little, choosing instead to let the process unfold, knowing that the truth carried more weight when it arrived complete. As the days ticked down, the association sent reminders, each one more confident than the last, assuming compliance through exhaustion. They had misjudged the situation. By the time the injunction hearing approached, the evidence was ready, and the auction trail told a story they had not anticipated being told. The chapter of quiet assumption was ending, and the next would begin not with paperwork, but with exposure, as the roots of the situation reached far deeper than anyone on the board seemed to realize. The days between filing the injunction and the hearing stretched in a way that made time feel uneven, as if every hour carried different weight depending on who controlled it. On the surface, the neighborhood continued its routines with practiced calm. Trash bins appeared and disappeared on schedule, lawn crews moved in predictable loops, and the association's weekly email went out with cheerful reminders about parking rules and seasonal decorations. Beneath that polished rhythm, something else was moving, something quieter and far more deliberate. I spent those days tracing the paper trail the association had assumed no one would ever follow. Each document led to another, every form revealing a small inconsistency that grew larger when placed next to the rest. The hazard declaration had no timestamp tied to an inspection, only a vague reference to an internal review. The vote authorizing removal appeared in meeting minutes that had been uploaded days after the supposed meeting date, with attendance listed but no individual votes recorded. The contracted removal service had been selected through an expedited process, a phrase that appeared nowhere in the bylaws, but appeared repeatedly in recent decisions involving costly actions. It was as if the board had created its own shortcuts and then normalized them through repetition. I requested copies of prior hazard removals, and when they finally arrived, the pattern became unmistakable. Each case involved mature trees or structures with resale value, each one routed through the same intermediary company, each one justified by language that leaned heavily on urgency while offering little substance. The sibling-owned entity appeared again and again, always at the end of the chain, quietly benefiting from assets stripped under the banner of community safety. I compiled everything into a timeline that showed not just what had happened to my tree, but how often this mechanism had been used before. It wasn't an isolated overreach, it was a system. As I worked, I could feel the association's silence pressing in from the other side. They had stopped responding altogether, a tactic that suggested confidence rather than concern. Silence is often mistaken for neutrality, but in environments like this, it is a signal of assumed authority, the belief that ignoring resistance will make it disappear. Neighbors began stopping by, first casually, then with more intention. They had heard fragments of the situation through whispers and forwarded emails, and curiosity drew them closer. I explained the basics without dramatizing it, letting the facts speak for themselves. People reacted not with immediate outrage, but with a slow dawning unease as they realized the same rules that threatened my tree governed their homes as well. The idea that an association could declare an emergency without evidence and then profit from the outcome unsettled them in a way fines and warnings never had. Meanwhile, the auction listing quietly gained watchers. I monitored it daily, noting the usernames of those who favorited the lot. Most were anonymous, but a few had profiles that revealed histories of bidding on similar materials from association-managed properties. It was a niche market, one that thrived on the assumption that these transactions were routine and uncontested. The realization hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about stopping a single removal, it was about interrupting a revenue stream built on obscurity. I prepared an exhibit binder for the hearing that told the story visually, starting with photos of the tree as it stood, healthy and integrated into the landscape, then moving through the notices, the lack of inspection records, the arborist report, and finally the auction trail that led directly to the board president's family. Each page was labeled clearly, each connection highlighted without exaggeration. The goal wasn't to overwhelm, but to clarify. In parallel, I began drafting a public records request to the city, seeking communications between the association and municipal departments regarding hazard declarations. Associations often imply coordination with authorities to bolster their decisions, but actual correspondence tends to tell a different story. If the city had not been notified of any imminent danger, it would further undermine the association's claims. The request went out, and with it, another clock started ticking. The night before the hearing, I walked out to the tree and stood beneath it, looking up at the branches against the dark sky. The leaves moved gently, and for a moment the entire conflict felt small compared to the scale of time the tree represented. It had endured storms without committees, droughts without assessments, and it was strange to think its greatest threat came not from nature, but from a set of bylaws written decades after it took root. The morning of the hearing arrived quietly. The association representatives appeared confident, carrying thin folders that suggested they expected a procedural exercise rather than scrutiny. I brought the binder, heavy with evidence, and the arborist's affidavit, signed and notarized. The judge listened as the association outlined its authority, leaning heavily on the language of discretion and community welfare. When it was my turn, I presented the facts in sequence, resisting the urge to editorialize, the lack of inspection. The independent report contradicting the hazard claim, the expedited process that bypassed standard safeguards, and finally, the auction trail. The room shifted perceptibly as the connection became clear, as the intermediary company's registration details appeared on record alongside the board president's name. Conflict of interest has a way of cutting through procedural arguments, reframing them as self-serving rather than protective. The injunction was granted narrowly but decisively, halting the removal pending a full review. The relief was immediate but measured. This was not a victory, just a pause, a chance to bring the rest of the story into the open. Outside the courthouse, the association representatives avoided eye contact, their earlier confidence replaced by something tighter and more guarded. I knew that granting an injunction would not end the matter, it would escalate it. People who rely on quiet systems do not abandon them easily when challenged. They adapt, regroup, and attempt to reassert control through other means. As expected, the association sent out a carefully worded email that afternoon, framing the injunction as a routine delay and reassuring residents that safety remained the top priority. It omitted any mention of the conflict of interest, the auction, or the evidence presented. That omission was as telling as any admission. I forwarded the city records request follow-up and began preparing a summary for neighbors who wanted to understand what had happened without wading through legal language. The more people understood, the less power silence held. The tree stood untouched, its shadow stretching across the lawn as it always had, now temporarily protected by an order that acknowledged what common sense already knew. But the deeper issue remained unresolved, and the trail I had uncovered pointed beyond a single decision to a pattern that would not withstand scrutiny. The next phase would require bringing that pattern into the light, beyond the courtroom and into the broader awareness of everyone governed by the association's rules, setting the stage for consequences that extended far beyond one tree and one board. The injunction changed the atmosphere of the neighborhood in ways that were subtle at first, like a pressure shift you feel before a storm but can't yet explain. The tree still stood, rooted and calm, but the association's authority no longer felt absolute. It had been paused, questioned, forced to justify itself, and that alone unsettled a system built on residents assuming compliance was easier than resistance. In the days following the hearing, information began to move in unexpected directions. People who had once skimmed newsletters without thought now reread them more carefully. Old emails resurfaced, forwarded with notes attached, asking whether certain assessments or emergency actions had ever truly been emergencies at all. I began receiving messages from neighbors I barely knew, some cautious, some urgent, all circling the same realization that if this could happen to one property so easily, it could happen to any of them. What struck me most was how many stories emerged once people felt there was a reason to speak. A fence removed and rebuilt at inflated cost. A shed declared non-compliant and dismantled without appeal. A tree trimmed so aggressively it never recovered, later sold as reclaimed wood through channels no one had questioned at the time. Each incident had seemed isolated when it happened, framed as enforcement or safety, but together they formed a pattern of selective urgency and quiet profit. I documented these accounts carefully, separating verifiable facts from impressions, knowing that credibility depended on discipline. Meanwhile, the association moved to contain the situation. A special bulletin went out announcing a forthcoming internal review of hazard policies, presented as a proactive measure unrelated to any specific case. The language was smooth and deliberately vague, emphasizing transparency without committing to disclosure. At the same time, the auction listing for my tree quietly disappeared from the salvage site, replaced by a generic note indicating the lot had been withdrawn. No explanation was offered, and no acknowledgement was made of why it had existed in the first place. The intermediary company's website went offline shortly after, its landing page replaced by a maintenance notice that lingered day after day. These small retreats confirmed what the evidence already suggested. The exposure had reached the right nerve. I received the city's response to my records request at the end of the week. A thick packet of emails and memos that revealed the association had never notified municipal authorities of any imminent hazard related to my tree. In fact, the only communication on the subject was a generic inquiry sent after the injunction was filed, asking whether permits would be required if removal eventually proceeded. It was a reactive step, not a precautionary one, and it directly contradicted the association's implication that it had been acting in coordination with the city all along. I added this to the growing file, updating the timeline to reflect not just what had been done, but what had not. Absence in cases like this can be as revealing as action. As the information spread, the association's leadership began appearing less unified. One board member resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons in a brief announcement that raised more questions than it answered. Another stopped attending meetings altogether. The board president remained visible, issuing statements that emphasized stability and continuity, but the tone had shifted, growing defensive, layered with reminders about the importance of order and the dangers of misinformation. Those warnings landed differently now, less like guidance and more like anxiety. I attended the next open board meeting, sitting quietly as observers filled the room beyond capacity. The agenda was routine, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. Residents listened with new attentiveness, noting what was said and what was skipped. When the hazard policy review was mentioned, it was framed as a future discussion deferred to a later date, a tactic designed to buy time. I took notes not because I planned to speak, but because presence itself had become a statement. The association could no longer assume disinterest. After the meeting, a small group gathered outside, exchanging information, comparing experiences, connecting dots. What had once been private frustrations were becoming collective concerns. I shared copies of the public records response with those who asked, careful to let the documents speak without embellishment. Trust grows when people are allowed to reach conclusions on their own. At home, I continued preparing for the next legal step. The injunction required a fuller hearing, one that would examine not just the hazard claim, but the process behind it. I worked with an attorney to draft a motion compelling disclosure of the association's contracts with vendors and intermediaries over the past 5 years. The scope was broad by design, aimed at revealing whether my case was an anomaly or part of a larger practice. Predictably, the association objected, arguing relevance and burden, but the groundwork had been laid. The conflict of interest was no longer speculative. It was documented, and that shifted the balance. Late one evening, as I organized files, an email arrived from an unfamiliar address. It was brief and carefully worded, expressing concern about recent events and offering to share information confidentially. The sender identified themselves as a former contractor who had worked with the association on multiple hazard removals. We arranged to speak, and over the course of the conversation, a clearer picture emerged. The expedited process I had noticed wasn't informal, it was structured. Certain vendors were pre-approved, certain intermediaries preferred, and justifications were often drafted after decisions had already been made. The contractor described being instructed to backdate assessments and inflate risk language, practices they eventually refused to continue, prompting their quiet exclusion from future work. I asked for documentation, and they provided what they could: emails, invoices, notes that corroborated the pattern. This new layer of evidence transformed the situation again. It was no longer just residents questioning authority. It was an insider confirming abuse of process. I added the materials to the file, verifying details where possible, mindful of protecting the source. Outside, the neighborhood felt different now. Conversations lingered longer at mailboxes. People walked past the tree and paused, seeing it not just as landscaping, but as a symbol of something larger, a test case for whether rules existed to serve the community or those who controlled them. The association's next move came sooner than expected. A notice appeared announcing a special election to fill the vacant board seat and to vote on amendments clarifying emergency powers. The timing was telling. Clarifying authority after it has been challenged is often an attempt to legitimize what was previously assumed. The proposed amendments expanded discretion rather than limiting it, framing oversight as an obstacle to swift action. I read the language carefully, noting how it sidestepped accountability while appearing to promote efficiency. I shared an analysis with neighbors who asked, highlighting the implications without telling anyone how to vote. Information, I had learned, was more effective than persuasion. As the date for the full hearing approached, pressure mounted on all sides. The association sent multiple reminders urging residents to attend the special election, emphasizing civic duty. At the same time, it resisted disclosure in court filings, arguing that vendor relationships were proprietary. The contradiction was stark: transparency when it reinforced authority, confidentiality when it threatened it. I finalized the evidentiary exhibits, now far more extensive than when this had begun, and prepared for testimony that would trace the story from a single notice stapled to bark to a network of decisions driven by private interest. The tree remained untouched, its leaves shifting with the season, unaware that it had become the center of a widening reckoning. The quiet before the flood was ending. Information was pooling, pressure building, and the structures that had relied on obscurity were beginning to show cracks, setting the stage for consequences that would reach far beyond one property line and into the foundations of the association itself. The special election announcement did not calm the neighborhood the way the board likely intended. Instead, it sharpened attention, turning casual observers into readers of fine print and reluctant participants into active stakeholders. The proposed amendments circulated quickly, annotated in the margins by residents who had never before considered how language could quietly rearrange power. Words like clarification and efficiency were doing heavy lifting, presented as neutral improvements while expanding discretion in ways that would make future challenges harder, not easier. The timing made the intent obvious. Authority under scrutiny seeks insulation, and insulation is easiest to install when people are tired. But fatigue had not yet set in. The injunction had created space for people to breathe, and in that space, curiosity had grown into resolve. I spent long evenings fielding questions, not as an organizer but as a translator of documents, explaining how emergency powers are meant to work, how checks exist to prevent abuse, and how the proposed changes would blur those lines until oversight became optional. I avoided rhetoric, relying instead on structure and sequence, because outrage burns quickly while understanding lasts. As the election date approached, the association intensified its messaging, framing participation as unity and dissent as distraction. The board president's name appeared at the bottom of every communication, steady and omnipresent, as if repetition alone could restore confidence. Meanwhile, the discovery process moved forward in fits and starts. The association produced partial records, redacted heavily, claiming privacy and trade secrets where public governance was involved. Each redaction was logged, each omission noted, building a secondary record of resistance. When the contractor's documents were added to the court file under seal, the narrative shifted again. The judge ordered limited disclosure of vendor contracts, enough to establish whether the intermediary relationship was isolated or systemic. The response confirmed what the pattern already suggested. Over multiple years, similar arrangements appeared, always rooted through entities that obscured direct connections, always justified by urgency, always profitable for someone adjacent to the board. As these facts circulated quietly among residents, the tone of conversations changed. People stopped asking whether something was wrong and started asking how it had been allowed to persist. The tree, once a backdrop, became a reference point, a shared image that anchored abstract concerns to something tangible. People touched the bark as they passed, noticing details they had never paid attention to before, as if grounding themselves in something real amid the swirl of paper and policy. The association attempted a show of normalcy by hosting a seasonal event, complete with banners and refreshments, but attendance was thin and conversations hushed. Trust, once cracked, does not repair itself with balloons. On the legal front, the association filed a motion to dissolve the injunction, arguing that the withdrawal of the auction listing rendered the issue moot. The argument ignored the broader question of process and conflict, focusing narrowly on the immediate threat. The court disagreed, maintaining the injunction and scheduling a consolidated hearing to address governance issues raised by the evidence. That decision sent a clear signal. This was no longer about a single action, but about the integrity of the system that produced it. The special election arrived under that shadow. Ballots were cast with unusual care, and the proposed amendments failed by a margin large enough to dispel any claim of misunderstanding. The vacant seat was filled by a resident who had publicly committed to transparency and independent review, a small but meaningful shift in the board's composition. The board president issued a statement acknowledging the results and pledging to work collaboratively moving forward. The words landed softly, almost apologetically, a departure from earlier certainty. But collaboration requires disclosure, and disclosure was still being resisted. In the days that followed, the association's insurance carrier entered the conversation, requesting information about the litigation and the allegations of self-dealing. That development introduced a new dynamic. Insurers have little tolerance for governance failures that expose them to risk, and their involvement often accelerates accountability in ways internal processes do not. Requests for documents multiplied, timelines tightened, and the association's counsel shifted strategy, signaling openness to mediation while maintaining formal denials. I declined mediation that would limit discovery, understanding that quiet settlements often preserve the very structures that enable abuse. Transparency was the goal, not compromise. The city, now fully aware of the situation, initiated its own inquiry into the association's representations regarding hazards and coordination. That inquiry brought municipal standards into play, standards that do not bend to private bylaws. As these parallel tracks advanced, the intermediary company quietly dissolved, its registration terminated without announcement. The board president's sibling removed references to the business from online profiles, a digital erasure that came too late to matter. Screenshots preserve what intentions would prefer to forget. The consolidated hearing arrived with a sense of inevitability. The evidence was no longer fragmented. It was coherent, supported by documents, testimony, and patterns too consistent to dismiss. The association's narrative of isolated decisions gave way under cross-examination, revealing a culture of convenience masquerading as governance. The judge's questions focused not on motives, but on safeguards, or rather, the lack of them. Why were inspections undocumented? Why were conflicts undisclosed? Why did emergency processes recur without emergencies? The answers circled without landing. When the ruling came, it did not declare villains or meet punishment. Instead, it ordered a comprehensive audit of the association's hazard declarations, vendor relationships, and governance practices over a defined period, supervised by an independent firm. The injunction remained in place pending the audit's findings. The tree was safe, for now, protected not by sentiment, but by process finally applied as intended. The ruling rippled outward, affecting not just my property, but every decision the association had made under the same framework. Residents reacted with a mix of relief and apprehension, understanding that audits uncover truths that can be uncomfortable even when they are necessary. The board president announced a temporary leave of absence shortly thereafter, citing the need for focus during the review. It was a quiet exit, lacking ceremony, signaling an end to the era of unchallenged authority. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood recalibrated. Meetings became more substantive, minutes more detailed, questions more welcome. The audit team arrived and began its work, requesting access to records that had once been treated as internal. The process was methodical, unglamorous, and thorough, the kind of work that rarely attracts attention but changes outcomes. Through it all, the tree continued to stand, leaves shifting with the season, a living measure of time against which the pace of human systems could be judged. It had not asked to be a catalyst, but it had become one, drawing lines in the soil that separated assumption from accountability. As the audit progressed, it became clear that the story was entering a new phase, one where consequences would take shape not through confrontation, but through findings, recommendations, and the slow restructuring of power. The next chapter would not be defined by discovery alone, but by what the community chose to do with the truth once it was fully, undeniably revealed. The audit did not arrive like a thunderclap. It settled in like a fog, quiet and methodical, changing the shape of daily life without announcing itself. Clipboards appeared, requests multiplied, and the association office, once a place of routine transactions and tidy assurances, became a site of careful scrutiny. Files that had sat untouched for years were retrieved, their edges yellowed, their labels vague. The auditors asked questions that did not accuse but clarified, the kind that expose inconsistencies simply by existing. Dates were compared, signatures were matched, justifications were weighed against outcomes. It was a process designed to let the numbers speak for themselves, because numbers remember even when people prefer not to. Residents felt the shift almost immediately. Maintenance schedules paused, new assessments were postponed. Decisions that once moved swiftly now stalled, waiting for confirmation that never came quickly enough. The association's rhythm slowed, and in that slowing, people noticed how much of its previous confidence had been borrowed from momentum rather than merit. I continued to document, not because I expected to be asked, but because patterns emerge most clearly when recorded alongside events. The auditors requested interviews with past board members and contractors, and the willingness to participate varied. Some were eager, relieved even, as if they had been waiting for permission to tell a fuller story. Others declined or offered rehearsed responses that avoided specifics. Avoidance, too, is a data point. The interim board member elected after the special election pushed for open sessions with the auditors, a move that met resistance from council but ultimately proceeded in limited form. Those sessions, stripped of theatrics, focused on governance mechanics, how emergency determinations were made, who documented them, and where oversight should have occurred. The answers revealed a culture of assumption. Authority had been treated as a substitute for verification, and convenience had filled the gaps where accountability should have lived. As the weeks passed, preliminary findings began to circulate in draft form among the auditors and council, not yet public but substantial enough to influence behavior. The association's insurer issued a reservation of rights letter, a technical document with heavy implications, signaling that coverage might not apply if self-dealing or gross negligence were confirmed. That letter changed conversations instantly. Risk has a way of clarifying priorities, and suddenly transparency was no longer framed as a courtesy, but as a necessity. The board scheduled a town hall, promising updates and questions. Attendance overflowed into the hallway, and the mood was different from previous meetings. There was no shouting, no spectacle, just a collective attention sharpened by the sense that something foundational was being recalibrated. I sat among neighbors who had once avoided eye contact at meetings and now shared notes, pointing quietly to passages in the bylaws, comparing language to lived experience. When the board acknowledged the audit scope, it did so with restraint, avoiding conclusions while conceding that processes had failed. The admission mattered not because it was dramatic, but because it was on record. Meanwhile, the auditors followed the money. Hazard removals were traced from declaration to disposition, costs compared to market rates, proceeds mapped to accounts. The pattern that emerged was precise rather than sensational. Fees were consistently inflated. Competitive bids were absent or perfunctory. Intermediaries captured value that should have returned to the association or been avoided entirely. The sibling-owned entity appeared repeatedly, sometimes directly, sometimes through layered subcontracting designed to obscure origin. Each appearance was documented, each connection footnoted. The draft report framed these findings not as crimes, but as governance failures with predictable outcomes. Language matters in reports like these. It determines whether reform feels optional or unavoidable. Outside the formal process, the neighborhood continued to adjust. The tree had become a quiet meeting point, a place where people lingered and talked about matters they had once assumed were out of reach. Someone brought a bench and placed it nearby, unofficial and unannounced. No one removed it. Children climbed the lower branches under watchful eyes, and birds returned as they always had, indifferent to the significance humans had assigned to the place. The association attempted to regain footing by proposing interim guidelines, emphasizing checks and balances that had previously been absent. The proposals were earnest but cautious, shaped by the awareness that anything too bold would be measured against the audit's findings. I reviewed the drafts when asked, offering feedback grounded in principle rather than preference. Systems work when they anticipate misuse, not when they rely on goodwill. The city's inquiry advanced in parallel, focusing on representations made by the association in filings and correspondence. That inquiry confirmed that hazard language had been used to bypass permitting processes in ways that strained credibility. Municipal standards are less forgiving than private ones, and the city's preliminary letter requested corrective action and training, introducing external oversight into a space that had long resisted it. As the final audit report neared completion, tension gathered. Rumors circulated, some exaggerated, some understated, but the core expectation was clear. The findings would require change. The board president's leave of absence extended indefinitely, and an acting chair assumed responsibilities with a markedly different tone. Communications shifted from directive to explanatory, from assumption to acknowledgement. When the audit was finally released, it did not explode into headlines. It landed with weight. The executive summary outlined deficiencies in process, documentation, and conflict disclosure. Recommendations followed, specific and actionable. Mandatory independent inspections, disclosure of related party transactions, competitive bidding thresholds, resident notice requirements, and restitution where overcharges were identified. The report stopped short of assigning personal blame, but it named the mechanisms that had allowed private benefit to grow from public authority. The association accepted the recommendations formally, committing to implementation under auditor supervision. Restitution calculations began, and credits appeared on accounts that had been quietly overbilled. The insurer, satisfied that corrective action was underway, agreed to limited coverage moving forward contingent on compliance. For many residents, the numbers told stories they had felt but never seen quantified. It changed how they viewed not just the past, but their role in the future. Governance, they realized, is not something that happens to a community. It is something a community either tends or neglects. The tree remained, now officially recognized as a protected asset pending routine maintenance, its status documented in a way that felt both unnecessary and reassuring. I watched as people read the report, some slowly, some with urgency, and saw the same reaction repeat. A mix of vindication and regret, relief that the system could correct itself and regret that it had taken so long. The audit did not end the story, it reframed it. Consequences were now procedural rather than personal, structural rather than dramatic. The association began the slow work of rebuilding trust, a task measured not in announcements but in consistent behavior over time. As autumn deepened, leaves fell from the tree and gathered on the lawn, ordinary and unremarkable, a reminder that life continues even as systems change. The numbers had remembered what people tried to forget, and in doing so, they had given the neighborhood a chance to choose differently. The next chapter would test whether those choices would hold once attention faded and routines returned, or whether vigilance would become as habitual as the shade the tree provided, steady and earned. The weeks following the audit felt quieter than anyone expected, the kind of quiet that comes after a room empties and the echo of voices fades, leaving behind the truth of what was said. There was no celebration, no victory lap, only a cautious recalibration as the neighborhood adjusted to a new normal shaped less by authority and more by awareness. Credits appeared on accounts with little fanfare, line items reversing charges that had once been unquestioned. Notices were rewritten, stripped of urgency where urgency could not be proven. The association office adopted a slower cadence, decisions rooted through newly established checks that required patience instead of assumption. It was tempting to mistake the absence of drama for resolution, but governance does not end when reports are filed. It begins when attention moves elsewhere. People return to their routines, but not entirely. Conversations at the mailbox still drifted toward process and precedent. The bench near the tree became a quiet forum where neighbors sat and talked, sometimes about nothing at all, sometimes about how easily systems drift when no one is watching. I noticed how language had changed. Words like emergency and compliance lost their edge, replaced by documentation and review. The acting chair held open office hours, not as a gesture, but as a requirement, and attendance was steady. Questions once considered disruptive were now logged and answered, their answers archived for anyone to read. The association's website posted vendor contracts and inspection reports as a matter of course, an ordinary transparency that would have seemed radical months earlier. The city closed its inquiry with a directive mandating periodic training and reporting, a formal reminder that private governance does not exist in a vacuum. That directive introduced an external clock, one that ticked regardless of board composition or resident interest. It was an anchor against regression. Still, the human element lingered. Former board members resurfaced in subtle ways, attending meetings without speaking, watching the process they once controlled now move without them. Some neighbors struggled with the realization that harm had occurred without malice, that the system had rewarded convenience rather than cruelty. Others wrestled with anger that it had taken personal risk to force accountability. I felt both at different moments, aware that truth rarely offers the simplicity of villains and heroes. The tree, now officially cataloged and scheduled for routine care, stood unchanged, its presence a constant amid the administrative shifts. Winter approached, and with it the test of whether vigilance would survive boredom. It is easy to care when stakes are visible, harder when they recede into spreadsheets and policies. I resisted the urge to disengage entirely, choosing instead to step back just enough to let others carry the weight. A small committee formed to review governance annually, rotating membership to avoid capture. Their first report was unremarkable, which felt like success. The association's insurer renewed coverage under stricter terms, embedding compliance into financial reality. Money, like numbers, remembers. Months passed. New residents moved in, unaware of the tree's story until someone mentioned it casually, as if recounting a local legend. The telling was simpler now, less charged, focusing on outcomes rather than conflict. That simplification mattered. It meant the lesson had been absorbed. The acting chair announced a permanent replacement election, and candidates spoke openly about process rather than promises. The election was uneventful, a word that would have sounded dismissive before but now felt earned. When spring returned, the tree leafed out fully, shading the bench where someone had added a small plaque, unofficial and understated, noting the year and a simple phrase about stewardship. No one objected. Life continued as it always does, but with a slight correction, a subtle alignment toward accountability that would need maintenance like anything else. I found myself thinking less about what had been stopped and more about what had been built. Habits of attention, structures that assumed error and planned for it, a community that understood its power without needing to wield it loudly. The applause, if there had ever been any, had faded, replaced by something quieter and more durable. And in that quiet, the system held. Time has a way of testing reforms not through crisis, but through comfort. As the seasons shifted again, the neighborhood settled into its revised routines with an ease that could have been mistaken for forgetfulness. It was not forgetfulness, though. It was normalization, the slow absorption of better practices into everyday life, until they no longer felt like responses to a scandal, but like the way things had always been done. The association's meetings were calmer, agendas clearer, minutes detailed and promptly posted. Independent inspections became so routine that no one remarked on them. Competitive bids arrived on time, compared side by side without urgency theatrics. The language of emergency faded into rarity, reserved for moments when it truly applied. This quiet competence did not announce itself. It simply worked. The tree continued to anchor the corner of the block, its canopy filling out fully by late spring, leaves catching light in ways that drew the eye without demanding attention. The bench beneath it became a waypoint in people's days, a place to pause, to wait, to talk. Children learned to ride bicycles nearby, wobbling past the roots, watched by neighbors who had once avoided one another's gaze. The sense of ownership had changed. It was no longer abstract or delegated. It was shared, exercised through attention rather than control. The annual Governance Review Committee released its second report, concise and unremarkable, noting compliance across all recommendations and suggesting minor refinements that reflected lessons learned. It passed without debate. That, too, felt like progress. Yet quiet places remember. They store stories not in headlines but in habits, in the way people react when something seems off. The test came without warning, as tests often do. A severe storm rolled through late one night, the kind that pulls at branches and rattles windows, the kind that tempts quick declarations in the morning light. By noon, rumors circulated about fallen limbs and blocked sidewalks. In the past, this would have triggered urgent notices and unilateral action. Instead, the process unfolded deliberately. Inspectors were scheduled. Temporary barriers were placed where needed. Notices went out explaining what would happen and when. The tree lost a branch, substantial but not catastrophic, its break clean where stress had found a weak point. Photos were taken, assessments logged, and the plan shared openly. No one suggested auction. No one rushed to authority. Maintenance occurred, the branch removed, the canopy balanced. The incident passed, leaving behind a sense of relief not because nothing had happened, but because something had happened and been handled well. That relief lingered. It taught a lesson deeper than any audit could. Systems designed for transparency do not slow response, they steady it. I watched neighbors read the notices with interest rather than suspicion, and I realized how far trust had come. Trust does not mean blind acceptance, it means confidence that questions will be answered without penalty. The acting chair, now permanently elected, held a brief update meeting beneath the tree, informal and unscripted, summarizing actions taken and inviting questions. People asked practical things. They listened to answers, they left satisfied. No one filmed it. No one posted commentary. The moment existed and then moved on. Later that summer, the association hosted a workshop on governance basics for new residents, covering bylaws, rights, and responsibilities with an emphasis on participation. Attendance exceeded expectations. The presentation included a case study anonymized enough to be instructive without reopening wounds. It focused on process failures and corrective measures, not personalities. The story was no longer mine to tell. It belonged to the community, shaped and reshaped into a lesson about stewardship. I felt the distance grow and welcomed it. Distance meant sustainability. The city's oversight schedule ticked on, periodic and predictable, another layer of memory that would outlast individual enthusiasm. Insurance terms remained firm, embedding discipline into budgets and renewals. Money continued to remember. Numbers continued to remember. And people in their quieter way remembered too. Still, not all memory is neat. There were moments when old habits surfaced, when someone proposed a shortcut or questioned the need for documentation. Each time the response was gentle but firm, a collective correction rather than a confrontation. The community had learned that accountability need not be loud to be effective. It could be practiced like maintenance, ongoing and attentive. I found myself spending less time on records and more time simply being present, sitting on the bench with a book, watching the play of light through leaves, listening to conversations that had nothing to do with bylaws. The tree was no longer a symbol in the way it once had been, it was a place. That shift mattered. Symbols demand vigilance, places invite care. As autumn approached again, leaves gathered and were cleared without incident. A small volunteer day organized around the tree brought people together to mulch and clean, an act that felt both ordinary and significant. No notices were posted, no authority invoked. The work happened because it needed to happen. In those moments, the story felt complete, not because it had ended, but because it had transformed into something quieter and more durable than conflict. The long memory of quiet places is built this way, through repeated acts that affirm values without announcing them. The next challenge would come, as it always does, but it would arrive to a community that had learned to respond with patience, clarity, and shared responsibility. The tree would stand, changed by seasons but rooted in a deeper understanding, holding space for a future shaped less by fear of authority and more by confidence in process. Completion did not arrive with a date on a calendar. It arrived gradually, in the way the record began to speak for itself without anyone prompting it. Months after the audit, long after meetings had returned to routine and attention had shifted elsewhere, the association received a formal notice from the State Oversight Office acknowledging compliance and closing the file. It was a brief document, procedural and unemotional, but its existence mattered. It meant the story had moved from dispute to precedent, from argument to record. The association archived the audit, the city directives, and the policy revisions in a publicly accessible section of its website, not buried, not summarized, but complete. Anyone could read the timeline from start to finish and see how a single hazard declaration had unfolded into a comprehensive reckoning. That transparency did something subtle but powerful. It made denial impossible without requiring vigilance. The facts were now part of the landscape, like the tree itself, present whether anyone looked at them or not. New board members were required to review the materials as part of orientation, a quiet safeguard against institutional amnesia. Vendors signed disclosures before bidding, acknowledging conflict standards that had once been optional. Inspectors submitted reports directly to a shared repository, removing intermediaries from the chain. Each procedural change was small, almost boring, but together they created friction where abuse once slid through easily. Friction slows misuse. It does not stop good faith action. The association's finances stabilized under the new rules, costs aligning more closely with market rates, reserves rebuilding without surprise assessments. That stability had an unexpected effect on community life. Anxiety receded. People planned improvements without fear that arbitrary enforcement would erase them. Disputes, when they arose, resolved through documentation rather than escalation. The tree's annual inspection report was posted alongside others, unremarkable in its health and maintenance notes, another entry in a system finally doing what it was meant to do. I noticed how often people referred to the record rather than memory when questions came up. They checked dates. They read reports. They asked how decisions had been handled before. The culture had shifted from authority-based to evidence-based, a change that rarely announces itself but reshapes outcomes over time. The bench under the tree gained a second plaque, placed quietly by the governance committee, noting the establishment of independent oversight and the year it began. It did not name names or recount conflict. It simply marked continuity. Visitors asked about it occasionally, and residents explained without drama, the story shortened by repetition into a lesson about attention and care. I felt my role recede further, which felt right. Stories like this should not require a narrator once the system can speak for itself. On an afternoon marked by nothing in particular, I watched a new family pause by the tree, reading the plaques, asking questions, listening. The moment passed, ordinary and complete. The record had done its work, not by demanding remembrance, but by making forgetting unnecessary. It took a smaller incident to remind everyone why the record mattered, the kind that would have slipped through unnoticed in the old days because it carried no spectacle. A minor landscaping dispute surfaced on the far end of the neighborhood, involving a shared boundary and a routine maintenance request that years earlier would have been resolved with a curt notice and an invoice few would contest. This time the process unfolded differently, not because anyone was trying to prove a point, but because the habits had changed. Documentation was requested, an inspection was scheduled, a timeline was shared. The resolution took longer than some preferred, and impatience flickered briefly, but it was tempered by memory, not of conflict, but of consequence. People remembered what speed without scrutiny had cost them before. The association's response was measured and transparent, and when the final determination was posted, it included not just the decision, but the reasoning, citing standards and precedents drawn directly from the archived record. That citation mattered more than the outcome. It reinforced the idea that authority now flowed from process rather than position. Around that time, an external report surfaced in local news about similar associations facing investigations for self-dealing and undisclosed conflicts. Neighbors shared the article with a mixture of recognition and relief, aware that their own experience had positioned them differently. They discussed how easily they might have remained vulnerable if the tree had been removed quietly, if no one had followed the auction trail, if looking away had felt easier than paying attention. That realization brought a sober understanding of cost. The cost of looking away is not always immediate or visible. It accumulates, compounding quietly until it demands payment in trust, money, or stability. The tree stood through another season, its growth rings adding one more year to a history no ledger could fully capture. Leaves fell, were cleared, and returned to soil, a cycle that mirrored the community's own slow learning. I watched as people referenced the record instinctively now, not out of suspicion, but out of habit, and I understood that this was the true resolution. Not vindication, not reform alone, but a shared unwillingness to surrender attention again. The association's systems held under ordinary strain, and in doing so, they justified the effort it had taken to build them. The story was no longer about what had almost been lost, but about what vigilance had preserved, a lesson that did not demand retelling so long as the record remained open, and the community remembered quietly what it had once cost to look away. Endings rarely announce themselves, and this one arrived not as a conclusion but as a settling, the way dust finally rests after movement has ceased. The neighborhood carried on, its days marked by ordinary rhythms that no longer felt fragile. The association's processes moved with quiet competence, not because they were flawless, but because they were understood, shared, and expected to be questioned. The record remained open and accessible, not as a warning, but as an assurance that memory had been institutionalized, that forgetting would require effort rather than neglect. The tree stood in full leaf again, casting a shade that reached a little farther each year, its roots deepening into soil that had learned to hold it. People passed beneath without looking up, and that felt right. Landmarks become strongest when they no longer need attention. The bench beneath it bore the marks of use, the grain worn smooth where hands rested, a testament to time spent without agenda. Children who had once been carried now ran past on their own, their games indifferent to the history that had made the space feel safe. New residents learned the rules not through warnings, but through orientation sessions that treated governance as a shared craft rather than a set of prohibitions. They read the archived materials as part of becoming neighbors, absorbing the lesson without reliving the conflict. The association's finances continued to reflect restraint and clarity, reserves growing steadily, budgets discussed openly. Vendors adapted to the new expectations, those unwilling to disclose or compete fairly moving on without drama. The city's periodic reviews arrived and passed uneventfully, another quiet confirmation that systems can mature when designed to be questioned. On a warm afternoon, a routine maintenance crew arrived to prune branches near a sidewalk, the work scheduled weeks in advance, notices posted, inspection reports attached. The process was so ordinary it barely registered. Someone asked whether the tree would ever be removed, and the answer came easily, grounded in criteria and care rather than authority. Trees are removed when they must be, not when they are convenient. The sentence lingered for a moment, and then dissolved into conversation about weather and plans. I found myself thinking less about the chain of events that had led here and more about the texture of the present. Governance had become part of the background, like plumbing or roads, noticeable only when it failed. That invisibility was not neglect, it was success. The story had not ended because conflict had been resolved. It had ended because the conditions that produced the conflict had been altered. The shade beneath the tree felt cooler that day, or perhaps it was simply the relief of knowing that care had replaced control. I sat for a while and watched the light move, listening to the ordinary sounds of a place at ease with itself. Somewhere in the association's archives, the record remained, patient and complete, ready if ever needed again. That readiness was the true legacy, more enduring than any ruling or report. The tree would outlive all of it, adding rings to its quiet ledger, offering shade without asking permission, holding the memory of a moment when attention mattered and was given, and proving, year after year, that what is tended thoughtfully can last.